to another. One story finishes and the next one starts. And that's, I think, again, what happens here between Genesis 22, where we were last time, and Genesis 23, where we are going to start today. So I want to look at the first two verses of Genesis 23. Remember what's just happened. Right? Isaac has just been there on the altar, and God stepped in and changed that, and now everybody's come back. But look at now, a lot of time has passed here, right? We don't see really what's happened here, but a lot of time has passed. But the Bible goes to this next point, and I think it's important. So look at verse 1 and 2 of chapter 23 of Genesis. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kirjath Arabah, that is Hebron, the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. It's an interesting transition, kind of a whole different change of kind of what's going on. But maybe what it brings to mind for me is, how do you think that conversation between Abraham and Sarah went the night that God woke him up and said, tomorrow morning early you need to get up and go sacrifice Isaac? You know Abraham had to talk to Sarah about that, right? I mean, this was a special child in their lives, and it was somebody that they really cared for, really cared about. His name was Isaac, which means laughter, which they laughed at how good God had been to them. They'd shared this together, and probably Isaac had been very well taken care of and very much loved, probably even close to the point of being an idol, and I think that's probably why God tested him. But between those two, they had an immense love for Isaac. So I can imagine that there was a conversation between Abraham and Sarah. What I like to think, it doesn't say this, the scripture doesn't record it, this is just me thinking, is that it was a pretty short conversation. I'm guessing Abraham said, this is what God said, and Sarah probably said, okay. After all they'd been through together, it's hard to think that Sarah would start to doubt God now, right? I mean, look at it. We see here that she died at 127 years old. Assuming she married about 15, which was normal for the time, that's like 112 years of marriage. They'd been married 112 years. That's a long time, right? But think about what they'd been through in those 112 years. Right? God said, hey, Abraham, I want you to pack up all your stuff from this land and leave everything behind and go somewhere else, and I'll tell you when. I'll tell you where. You won't have any idea. Okay, that's pretty amazing. But Abraham packed up all the stuff he had, including his wife, Sarah, right? And they went on this journey. Now, I don't know how many of you are with your vacations, but how many times have you just jumped in the car and started driving? Right? Most of the time with a vacation, you have, at a minimum, a destination you want to get to or something you want to do. Or sometimes, I've even, to the point on some vacations, planned out day by day with the stuff that's going to go on, right? That's how we typically do it when we pack up and leave. That's not what Abraham and Sarah did. God said, I want you to go, and they did. And Sarah went with him. And they were nomads, wandering around, going wherever. Now, this was not some adventure that a couple newlyweds took part in, right? These guys was 65 at the time or so. So they'd been married. By the time God said, pick up everything you've got and leave, they had been married, living there, establishing this family, their household, for 50 years. At 50 years of marriage, God says, pack up and leave, and they do. Right? So right there, you can see that Sarah and Abraham have this trust and this faith in God. And they went. Now, it wasn't a perfect relationship the whole entire time, right? It was like many marriages that have ups and downs. They had family issues from outside members like Lot, right? That guy tagged along for some reason. He wasn't supposed to. There he is. Abraham's got him. That ends up dividing the family, splitting the land. Lot goes elsewhere. Then they worry about him. Then they see Sodom and Gomorrah going up in smoke, wondering if Lot survived, right? We see all of that go on. There's that kind of family drama. We know that Abraham lied, frequently, probably. A couple times is recorded anyway where he says Sarah is his sister. Can you imagine what that does to a marriage? That kind of put things into a damper, right? It ended up with Sarah being in a harem, getting ready to be one of Pharaoh's wives. That's a whole bunch of bad stuff going on right there, right? Now, Sarah wasn't perfect either, was she? She said, okay, God's going to give us this family. I believe that, but he's not going to do it through me. So here's my maidservant. Take her and have a child with her, and that's what's going to do it. There's some doubt there. Whenever she overheard God saying, Abraham, Sarah's going to have a child in her old age, what'd she do? She laughed, right? So Sarah doubts, Abraham lies, the family's around there that's got problems. It's not a perfect thing, right? They're not perfect people, but their marriage endured 112 years. It's pretty impressive, right? Which is why I like to think that when Abraham woke up that night from the vision that God had said and said, you need to go sacrifice your son, that Sarah, after being married for a long time, said, okay, I trust you. I've seen what God can do. This is how it has to be. And Abraham went off and did what he did. And I'm sure she was excited and she was thrilled when Abraham and Isaac both returned, but I think she probably had that same faith that Abraham did when he told his servants, me and the boy will come back. I think she probably knew that and knew that God was able to do great things. She doesn't get a lot of credit for that, but I think that's probably how it worked. So that's where we pick up the story, right? Isaac was young. Isaac's about 37 or so now, so it's been several years that have passed by. And now Sarah has lived her life. She has raised her child, the one that she wanted so bad for so long. And then at 127 years old, she passes away. Now it's been an incredible, for Abraham, not to say the least, I guess, 112 years of marriage. And during that time, Abraham has gathered a lot of wealth and a lot of servants and a lot of cattle and a lot of all of that, right? He's got a lot. But here's the thing with Abraham. He still doesn't really have a home. He's really still a nomad, okay? God has said, you've got a promised land, but Abraham hasn't got there yet. God said, this is all going to be your land, but God hasn't transferred ownership to Abraham and his descendants at this time. Abraham is just there, right? And he's traveling. He's got his tents. He's got his people. And by this time, he's got a pretty big contingency with him, right? Probably the size of some of the cities in the surrounding area are traveling with Abraham as he moves, if he moves, or where he goes. He's got this big family, these big servants, all these people around him. Okay, that's the people that are following Abraham. But he doesn't really have a home, which becomes a problem when you try to bury your spouse. It's kind of a big deal, right? So Abraham has this problem, and he's got to come up with a solution. And that's where we go here with the story. Look at the next few verses. Then Abraham stood up before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury the dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, and you may bury your dead. So here's what happens. Abraham doesn't have anywhere to go. So he goes to these people. And now, my translation says the sons of Heth. Does anyone say the Hittites? So there's some debate there on if it's the sons of Heth and the Hittites and who those are. It's either an Eastern European people or a people that are there in Canaan. It really doesn't exactly matter. Either way, there are some people here. Right? Some people that Abraham's lived around, but not yet part of. And Abraham goes to these people and he says, I'm a foreigner among you. I'm a visitor. And I would like a place to bury my dead. Now, Abraham could have treated this a little bit differently, right? Abraham, again, has power, has wealth, has servants. He's won some military victories. He's got some authority. He could have walked in and said, hey, people, God has given me all this land anyway. I'm going to go ahead and take this tomb for my people. Right? He could have done that, but that's not what happens, is it? Abraham walks in there, and he's very respectful. And he says, hey, I know God is going to give me this land, but I'm not going to tell you that yet. As of right now, I'm just a foreigner living among you. God hasn't signed over the deed. It's not mine yet. It's still yours, so here we go. I need some help. So Abraham goes to these people, very respectful and very respected. Right? And old Abraham, what would he have done in this time? He would have come up with some lie, some story, right? Some fib to get his way. That's not what he does. Very respectfully goes to these people and says, I've got a problem. Now they come back with a really good answer. Right? And they say, hey, Abraham, you're a pretty powerful guy in us. You're a mighty prince among us. You can have the choice that you want among our tombs. Now that seems like a pretty awesome offer, right? And on the surface it is. Right? They're saying you can have the best of the best. But the Hittites, the sons of Heth, the people in those days, they would have taken burial rituals very seriously. In fact, they would have thought that how you were prepared for burial would be how you would spend your afterlife, right? Think about the Egyptians, right? And the pyramids that they built, right? They built those for a reason, so that the dead would have somewhere to be in the afterlife. That's why they filled them with things and stuff and their pets. All that stuff is there, the same way that these people would have thought. How you're prepared and where you're buried is how you will spend the afterlife. It's a very serious deal to them. Now remember where Abraham came from. Do you remember what Abram means? What God Abram's father probably worshipped? The moon god. Right? So he's been in this time of false worship and of worshiping all these other gods. He's seen these times when there's lots of gods and these other rituals, and he really doesn't want anything to do with that. So as gracious as this offer is, Abraham wants to tread lightly on the subject of dealing with and messing with and participating in these other religions. So Abraham responds here. Look at verse 7. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron the son of Zohor for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpeth, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at full price as property for a burial place among you. So Abraham says, I appreciate it, I get it, I respect you, we understand we have something going here, this is okay, but what I want is this cave way out away. If you are so generous as to give me the best of the best, what I'm asking for is you just talk to somebody for me and give me that wasted extra one at the end of that field way out there. I'll even buy it. Okay? So Abraham's trying, I want to do as much as I can to separate myself from how you and your people are thinking about the afterlife and what gods they worship. So look at verse 10. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered at the gate of the city, saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of your sons, my people. I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, If you will give me it, please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. Okay, so here we see something else, right? So Ephron comes on. Obviously, Abraham is a respected guy. He's probably done some business deals there. He's probably treated them very fairly. And these people are respecting him. They also see that he's hurting, and they respect that. So what this man says, he's the man Abraham's requested. He wants the cave. He says, I'll give you the field. I'll give you the cave. You can have all of it. Again, seems very generous, right? Seems like a very generous offer. But Abraham, again, says, I want to give you money for the field. Why would he do that? Well, a couple of reasons, probably. One, he wants to make it a permanent site. Abraham doesn't have a home, right? He's wandering around. He knows this is going to be his ancestral claim. He knows that generations after this are going to live in this area, and he wants to make a permanent tomb. Again, burial rituals were very serious. It was said in that day that when you died, you were gathered with your father's bones. That's kind of the saying that it was. So what happened really is that you were placed in a tomb with your generation, and that's where you stayed, right? So it was a pretty big deal. It was kind of poetic. It was kind of a sense of being part of that family, and it was taken very seriously. And Abraham doesn't want somebody who owns the tomb that his generations are laid in, that it could at any time change his mind and kick them out. That wouldn't be very good, and he knew that would be a disgrace. So he says, no, I want to own it. I want it to be mine. I want it to be permanent. So, look at verse 14. Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My Lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead. Now, I've read some commentary that think that maybe Ephron at this point in time is taking advantage of Abraham. 400 shekels of silver, somebody equated about 10 pounds of silver. I don't know what that is in today's market value, but that's not a small sum of money, right? And they've compared it to some other land deals that were done and recorded throughout Scripture, and said that it's actually quite a bit of money. That maybe Ephron saw a hurting man, that he wanted to take some advantage of him, and gave him a really high price for that land, and Abraham went ahead and did that. I don't know if that's what it is, but either way, Abraham knew what he had to do, right? Abraham followed through with what he set out to do, and generations of his followers were buried there. Right? Lots of people, over and over again, were buried in this tomb that Abraham bought this time to bury his wife, Sarah. So it's an interesting little transaction that we see a little bit of the historical piece of what happened. We also see the human side of Abraham. We think of him as this great man of faith, right? This guy who was able to put his son on an altar and sacrifice him and pass that test. We see a man who has really come a long way in his faith from when we first met him, closer to the beginning of Genesis, and now he's been called to do this, and he knows that he trusts God. He's going on. But this whole time we've known Abraham, we've known him with his wife Sarah there. For 112 years or so, Sarah has been there, and now she's not. So now what? That's the big question, right? A lot of us ask that question whenever a big change happens in our life. Abraham, I'm sure, asked the same thing. Now what? Well, here's what happened. Abraham, he kept going. Right? He was still called by God. He knew if he was still on this earth, regardless of what the situation in his life was or how big the change might have been, that if he was still here, God still had a purpose for him. What was God's purpose? For generations and descendants to come through, as many as the stars in the sky or the sand in the desert. That's what he was called to do. And Abraham knew that God still wanted him to do that, so he did that. And we know Isaac at this time was about 37 years old. We also know at this time, because we'll see in the next chapter, that Isaac didn't have a wife. So if God was going to continue this lineage through Abraham and Sarah and then through their son, then he gave them Isaac. He's going to have a wife because he's going to have more descendants, right? That hasn't happened yet. Isaac's 37 years old. It's time that this whole thing happens, and Abraham figures that he's got to be a part of it. So he continues on with what God has given him. Abraham just keeps going with life. God blesses him. God continues to increase his wealth and the people around him. God continues to be there by his side. And as he continues to guide Isaac in the right direction, Abraham continues on with his life. Abraham actually, eventually he remarries again and has more children. I guess what God's trying to tell us here is that even when we lose something very close to us and very dear to us and very important to us, we've just got to keep going. If we're still here, God's still got a purpose. If we're still around, God still has something in mind and in store for us. Abraham is evidence of that. He's evidence of that, and he kept going. Now, what could God teach us about marriage through this? There's got to be a marriage lesson in here somewhere, right? 112 years of marriage. Can you imagine, like, let's if we could get Abraham and Sarah on Twitter on Valentine's Day, and we could say, hey, what is the secret to marriage? That's what we'd all ask, right? What's the secret to marriage? I don't know what they would say. I would like to hear it. It would be very interesting, I think. But what can we get from this story? There's got to be some stories, some information there, right, that God is telling us. I think he tells us a couple things. One, I think that God intends for marriage to be a shared faith journey. If that makes any sense. I think what God intends marriage to be is that a man and a woman walk side by side as they learn about God, as they share their faith in God, and as they grow in their faith in God. I think we see that with Abraham and Sarah. Right? A long time ago, 112 years ago, they were both looking forward to a life when they would live in Abraham's father's house, worshiping the moon god and doing whatever it is that Abraham's father did and instructed and guided them to do. That's what they wanted. Right? That's what they dreamed of. But together they learned about God on this journey. They packed up, they left, they experienced what they experienced. They learned about doubts and fears and God and perseverance and faith. They learned about all of that, but they learned it all together. And I think that's what God intends for us. Now, they didn't always agree, right? They didn't always agree. They didn't always get along. They didn't always even see things as God saw them, but they were working it together. I think that's healthy. I think what God intends is for people to bounce ideas off their spouse, to bounce what God is saying off their spouse, and to come up with the plan on how they can all worship God together. Because I think the second point of what God intends marriage to be is very important. And I think that comes from a decision from the spouse and how it's going to be to raise their children. I think what God intends is for marriage to help develop the next generation of Christ followers. Can you imagine the faith that Isaac saw in his household as he was raised up here in these 37 years before Sarah died? Can you imagine what he saw? I mean, he was there. He firsthand experienced this great test that we say Abraham passed as a man of faith. He was firsthand there. He was involved in it. Can you imagine him going back and telling the story to his mother? Can you imagine them all sitting around the dinner table explaining and talking about these great stories of faith and how good God has been? Right? Can you imagine the testimony that Abraham and Sarah would have shared with Isaac, that he would have heard probably countless times when they explained what his name meant, meaning he laughs? Can you imagine how Isaac sat around the table as a child would and say, "Mom and Dad, why are you so much older than all my friends' mom and dads? Can you explain that?" And the testimony that his mom and dad would have had to share with him. He experienced a household of faith because he was the promised child of God. Abraham and Sarah knew that it was more than it was about more than just having children, right? It was about developing in them into someone who follows God as they did. Right? Now, obviously, God intends for marriage to result in little people running around the earth. Right? That's part of what God intends. But He's got power. He could do that without having this commitment of marriage. I think what He does is He says it's more than just a little people running around. What God wants is little people that will grow up into men and women that worship and praise and acknowledge Jesus as their Savior. That's what He wants from us. Now, unfortunately, I think that today's world, that's the exception and not the rule. That there are fewer and fewer households that have this example of faith and live out this example of faith and show what a faithful marriage and a connection with God can look like between man, woman, and God. But when that happens, when that takes place, when that is accomplished, I believe great things result from it. If you were raised in a home with Christian parents, you know how good of an experience that was. And you probably didn't like it every Sunday morning going through high school when you were in church. You probably had some disagreements with your parents on where you should be and what you should wear and how you should act. But looking back now, I would imagine that most of us will say, praise God that I was raised in a house that knew Jesus as their Lord. That I'm absolutely thankful beyond words that could happen for me. And if you experience that, you know it too. On the flip side, if you have children or have raised children or have grandchildren or nieces and nephews that you also are trying to have the same attitude toward, you know that there is some pushback. And you know it's very much easier to tell them, no, you don't have to eat your spinach on your plate. Here's a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup instead, right? No, you don't have to go to church. We can do this instead. Or no, we don't have to read the Bible tonight. Or no, we don't have to pray tonight. Or no, we don't have to learn this lesson tonight. It's easier to say no, but if we make the struggle and make the attempt to raise these kids in households that can see God alive and well and active in the lives of God's children, then it's going to be worth the sacrifice that we have to make. I think that's what God intends for us to do. And I think that's been exemplified by what Sarah and Abraham did here with Isaac. Right? Not that Isaac was perfect, right? Not that Isaac didn't grow up and not make any mistakes. But he didn't come from perfect stock either, right? And none of our children did either. We all make mistakes, right? But what it comes down to is, who do we know is the guiding force in our lives? Abraham and Sarah knew and could not discount, they could not discredit, they could not say anything but God led them where they were, that God blessed them as He did, and they continued to preach that and say that and tell that to Isaac as he grew up. There's a whole lot to learn here about Abraham and his life, and we're here coming to the end where the narrative shifts from Abraham and Sarah more to a story about Abraham's descendant and Isaac. What I don't want us to forget is about Abraham and who he was and what he did and how he developed as a follower of God. He didn't wake up one morning and all of a sudden was a changed man. He had flaws, he had imperfections, but he continued to strive to get to know God better. You and I are the same way. Right? We came to God, we came to Him, we believed in Him, but we didn't immediately, drastically, 100% change overnight. It's a journey. Abraham lived a faith journey. And what it did is it resulted in promises of God and blessings from God that he experienced and then his generations long after experienced as well. So we would be smart to listen to the examples of Abraham, read the examples of Abraham, and continue to follow his lead as he developed with God. We're not done with the story of Abraham yet. We'll keep going. We've got a couple more weeks of this yet, but so keep reading ahead. Read Genesis. You can see where the story is going to go. But we'll finish here in a couple weeks. Anybody have anything this morning before we close? All right, let's sing one more song.